What's your first memory with storytelling? Because Cal makes sense. Soccer, you did it from childhood, but when was the first time that you felt a sense of, oh, I really want to tell this story, or I really want to talk or write about this? When was that for you?
I think that kind of dovetails with me growing up in Berkeley, and so much of growing up in Berkeley, and especially on campus, was learning about different people's stories and meeting so many different people from all over the world that had their own unique backstories. And the soccer part actually makes sense now. But when I look back on my story, really, it was kind of surprised to go into sports at all. I mentioned my mom being an environmental science, policy management professor. She's not a huge sports person, or definitely didn't push me towards it. I think she just sort of encouraged me to do everything and to take part in a bunch of different sports or music and theater or whatever it might be. And soccer just kind of stuck. But I remember growing up, and she would have a lot of her graduate students over and undergraduate students come over to our house in North Berkeley. And this will date me, but they had like slideshows at the time and they would do presentations. And it was just a really interesting place to grow up in Berkeley. Even the schools I went to and the people that I met all had different backstories. And so I think that was where the sense of story or understanding where you come from or where other people might have interesting stories came from. And then it was really more of a blending over time of how can I put these two disparate worlds together, my love of soccer and then my love of story or media, and put them together over time. But that kind of came later, and it looks clean and perfectly planned maybe at this time, but it was much more, I would say, of a natural progression or lucky collision than anything for me.
One of those life is understood backwards but lived forwards type of thing, because it really, like, I read your resume and media studies at Berkeley, and then overall number 10 draft pick for the MLS. Like it kind of makes sense to see where you ended up today. But that's interesting. I really want to just like for personal sense, right? Because for me, I always liked to talk to people. Like one of my grandparents say that some of the first memories they have with me, because I didn't live close to them, nor I don't live close to them now. But they say that the first memories they have of me is their ears getting too hot from holding the phone, because I would just talk and talk and talk for hours.
They're like, this guy needs a podcast.
Eventually, that's what happens, right? But I didn't realize that until my sophomore year of college, which was during the pandemic. How late was it for you? Like, did you just study media studies to study something, or was it with the purpose of doing some sort of storytelling in the future?
Yeah, I think it was pretty instinctual, similarly to the way that soccer was for me, where I wasn't pushed towards soccer, but when I found it, I just kind of wanted to keep doing it. And I found myself writing for the student newspaper in high school, and I enjoyed doing that. And then when I was picking my major, even before I came to Cal, I knew I wanted to do media studies, and I just I really gravitated towards those classes. I enjoyed them, although some of my favorite courses were in sociology. I did some ethnic studies courses and some sort of creative decals that I thought were really fun and interesting too. But it really was more just kind of following those instincts. And then the cool part was, as my soccer career started picking up and I was having success at Berkeley, then suddenly the Daily Cal was interviewing me, and there were features being put out on me. And then I got drafted, and the same thing. And I just started to grab those opportunities, and it really was a different time, I would say. Now I look at MLS and work in MLS for Apple TV, and the players are much more open to having their own presence. They see the profit that can come from it. I know you interview a bunch of NIL athletes, and I think it's shifted where athletes have their own podcast, they have their own voice, they understand their power that comes with it. But for me, it was a little bit of a different time where that was not really popular. It wasn't something that was regular for us. And so I was always interested in that. I wish I sort of played during this current environment, but now I guess just to cover it and to find my way post playing career is really when that started to open up and I could kind of blend those two worlds together.
So I am curious on what those struggles were like, because I've only heard stories. So just to put it into context, I was born in 2001. So I was kind of raised, my teenage years were raised with social media. And like, I remember I would save everything to my Snapchat memories in high school, because it was just like, I have to show my friends what we were up to at this high school football game later. And it's like early signs of me wanting to tell stories later on. But the more I listen to podcasts and people that have already made it in the podcast industry, I always hear that it just wasn't cool to be in front of the camera. They say that if they were born and raised throughout these times, it'd be so easy, because now the cool thing is like to be on TikTok or to be a YouTuber. Or we're back a decade ago, that wasn't cool at all. Was that something you felt like as an athlete? Was it like embarrassing at any point to be doing something like this? Because this is what I've heard, but I've never actually asked somebody if this is the case.
Yeah, I think especially when at the professional level, was when I started to notice that, where reporters would come out and often the attitude from the star players on my teams at least was like, not really interested. I'm going to keep it moving. And often the team PR or comm staff would come up and they'd be looking for just a warm body to go answer some of these questions. And I was willing. I would raise my hand and be like, yeah, sure, I'll go talk to them. And I ended up building some relationships with reporters that covered our team. And I mean, even to the standpoint of, we were playing CONCACAF Champions League in Panama. And I remember going down there with Houston Dynamo, and some of the Latin players on our team didn't want to do interviews. And the PR comms guy, Matt Peterson, great guy. He came up to me and we had a good relationship, and he was like, hey, I know you spoke Spanish a little bit. You studied it in school, and I hear you speaking it in the locker room to some of the guys. Cause when you play with guys from Honduras or Costa Rica, and, some guys don't actually even speak any English, and you're sitting in the locker room, and every morning I had Luis Camargos from Brazil, Portuguese, and Boniek Garcia, Honduran national team World Cup player to my right. So every day I'm moving between broken Portuguese, broken Spanish, and English. And that's just how you communicate in an MLS locker room. But I wasn't quite ready to do it on camera, or I didn't think so, but nobody else wanted to do it. And I was just like, I don't think I know anybody in Panama, so why not take a risk? None of my friends are going to see this. And it ended up being a really good risk to take, in the sense of, you start building some reps, some confidence. I also find people being really generous of like, if you're trying and it's not perfect even, that's okay. But then later on down the road, I got to go interview Chicharito when he signed for LA Galaxy, and it was in Seville in Spain. And I interviewed part of the interview in English and asked him questions in Spanish, and he answered in Spanish. And so if I hadn't, like I'm saying, I wasn't planning that this was going to work out, where when I interviewed Chicharito and he signs with MLS and I'm retired, like there was no way to know that could be of any use. But I think the idea of just kind of like being available, being interested, being willing to play whatever role you can possibly play, and learning, that was a big step. And I think something that ended up paying off for me.
Tell me a bit more about that last part, the being available or willing to play any role. And at least for me, that's what my story was like at Cal as a soccer player, just having to learn that role, because I mean, leading up to Cal, I obviously just didn't play that role. If not, I wouldn't have ended up here. But then you get to Cal and like, everybody has their own role. And that was mine personally. And I had to learn that, but I only graduated from undergrad a year ago. So this is my second season removed from the team. I'm curious as to, like, if there's a deeper story that you may have on what being available actually looks like outside of the soccer field and how it could be beneficial.
I think, it's a tricky one, because I think there's a balance to be struck between saying, hey, I'll play whatever role you need me. Like, I just want to get on the field. And then also having that internal strength and self-belief, because if you bend to any pressure, I would have given up so much, so long ago. And anytime you hear no, or you can't play that position, or you can't play that type of role for this team, that's something where people just give up. And so I feel like I had to kind of fight my way to Cal, and that helped me in the sense of when things didn't go my way, I kind of knew when to fight. And then I had to learn at times when to back off that and maybe say, okay, I'm going to play a little bit of a different role. Like, especially as you get to the higher levels, when I got to, where you're playing with international players that are playing in the World Cup, and it's like, hey, yeah, he can take the lead. And I just want to be a part of this. Or if I can make his day easier, or if I can give him the ball, or if I can make a run that opens up space, like that's something that I can contribute. And then I get on the pitch and I get a new contract, or I get a new path forward in my career, or we can win this game. And I think that's like a tricky balance, because you got to be bullheaded in order to quote unquote make it, or to have that resilience. But then also you have to be able to adapt and change and recognize like where your strengths are and maybe how you can accentuate others and take a step back even at times. So it's a tricky balance. I think we're all struggling with or dealing with at times, but, I think it's important to have a bit of both to be able to have success.
What about when you were trying to get your foot in the door with media?
Well, the hardest part for me was everybody that I spoke to, at least initially, was saying, hey, I think you have a lot of natural ability. You have some talent. I think you obviously know the game, but you just need some experience. And I was sitting there on the other side of an opportunity saying, well, how do I get experience if the only thing I need to get experience is experience? It felt impossible. And this just like, you're just in this washing machine of conversations with people, and just waiting for someone to kind of take a chance. And I think that's when I tried to grab my own opportunities or create my own opportunities. So I did some independent writing. I kind of went back to the drawing board. I started that fashion clothing line. I did a social media project during the World Cup. I submitted some articles to some soccer magazines, and eventually somebody on Twitter actually hit me up and was like, hey, I see you wrote this article. Like, can we have a chat? And that person ended up becoming my boss at MLS. And he asked me like, hey, have you ever thought about doing some on-camera opportunities? And meanwhile, I was like desperate. I'd created a reel. I'd tried everything in the book and wasn't able to get an opportunity. And I tried to play it cool and was like, yeah, I think I'd be open to that. Yeah, I think I could come out there to New York for a week. Why not? And from there, fast forward 7-8 years, I'm still in New York and have gotten all these amazing opportunities. But I think it started from just kind of not waiting for a chance and not taking, you just need experience to get experience, and kind of starting my own thing.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. And it's always fascinating how like one article or one social media post, like I was never expecting that. I thought, because I did see, so I looked over through your resume and the years, and I did notice that there is a somewhat of a gap, not too long, but there's somewhat of a gap there. A bit of US soccer work, a bit of writing work, your brand, and then you go back to the MLS. And it's just so interesting how, I don't know, I thought maybe an MLS contact, like something had happened there, but Twitter is interesting. I like I told you, I do want to talk more about storytelling, but I also just can't skip over your MLS career for very obvious reasons. To tie the two together, what were you doing in your off time? Like I see, for example, right now, former Cal Golden Bear, Drake Callender, current goalkeeper for Miami, and he just released his first children's book. And it's something I actually asked him about, and he wrote the whole thing on airplane rides. Like, because you just have so much free time of, I train. I don't know. I mean, how long can you train? Maybe maximum 4 hours a day. And then it's travel, hotel, meals, etc. Were you doing anything with storytelling with that free time, or was there that itch ever, or not really?
I think I was just taking the opportunities that were coming my way, or looking to, do as many media opportunities that were available. But I don't think I made the most of my time, if I'm being really honest here. I think I focused on my playing career and then I was resting. I did some coaching. I found out pretty quickly that wasn't for me. But near the end of my career is more where I started to get more serious. I had this kind of crazy day where we played an MLS Cup. It was the second year we went to MLS Cup with Houston. Lost the year prior to the Galaxy. Landon Donovan scored the game winner. It was in LA, 1-0. And then the next year went back, made it all the way back to MLS Cup, a rematch. Same thing. We're playing against the Galaxy. It's David Beckham's last game, Landon, Robbie Keane. And the day started out amazing. I scored a goal just before halftime. And then in the second half, I tore my knee and go down with an ACL injury, and within 10 minutes, bang, bang, 2 goals from the Galaxy. And it was really that next year when I started to transition, thinking about, okay, there's going to be an end at some point. I don't know exactly when this is going to be. And I had a lot of time on my hand doing rehab, and that wasn't enough to it didn't feel enough to really fulfill what I wanted to like do or where I was kind of leaning. And that's when I started doing a lot more media. I started working with Comcast Sportsnet. This guy, Sebastian Salazar, is now at ESPN. He was like, hey, I've interviewed you a bunch of times and I think you could be good at this. Why don't you do some pregame hits with me before your guys' matches? And I asked the club. They were very cool about it. And so suddenly I was on live TV before our matches working with Sebastian Salazar. And, now he's gone on and had great success. But I always thank him for giving me a chance to try to get out there. But it wasn't really towards the end of my time in MLS or towards the end where I started to get really serious about maximizing that off the field interest and exploring my interest in media.
Yeah, it's always interesting how, I guess for athletes, it's some sort of injury, but there's always some sort of obstacle that just points you in a completely different direction. And I had a similar case. So for me, the way this whole thing started was my freshman year. I just come into Cal and then I redshirt, and I was just like, oh, what the hell is this? I've never not played a single minute in a season. I was just like lost. And then, all right, I'll come back strong. Second semester, like I'll just improve. This will be my semester. And then COVID hits. And I was like, all right, well then I'll just work hard for a year and then I'll come back. And then I come back and then I tear my meniscus. And by then that's half of my career, right? And with all that downtime, eventually I was just started, like I started to feel something about, like I started to reflect, and I realized like, wow, I don't know any athletes at Cal. And I saw the Olympics and I saw these people and I'm like, I would love to talk to them. And that's what pointed me in this direction, right? Or like writing for the team. And it's always the way like those obstacles just point you in that direction. My question now is, once you're in that direction, how do you keep pushing, if that makes any sense? Because for me now, it's like, all right, the soccer part is over. I have a year left I'm in grad school right now. So I have a year left of grad school. But now that you're in that direction, do you wait for another obstacle to show up? Do you just keep pushing and that's the obstacle in and of itself? What was that gap for you of those multiple years that you had to figure it out?
Well, I'd say the good news is that media keeps shifting and the obstacles are plenty. You don't have to put them in front of you to sort of make any artificial difficulties, because it's, I've had a good run for sure, but also COVID, perfect example, really difficult. I was hosting a travel show before that. And then suddenly you go into COVID and you say, well, how are we going to do a travel show on MLS soccer culture? There's no MLS games even for a while until they created the bubble tournament. And then I tried to turn it into a podcast. And then I ended up sort of having to start all over. And then I started working outside of soccer for a while, and I did a piece for Vice News. And I was doing some reporting, and that was totally new and different for me, where I was taking some of the skill set that I learned doing documentaries around soccer and MLS. And then I was actually reporting on COVID vaccine trials and some different things that I had no real depth of experience in, but I knew I could try to parlay one thing into the next, and I was interested more than anything. And then suddenly now I'm calling broadcasts and I'm doing match analyst work and I'm doing studio work. And so it's like you have to be flexible. And it goes back to the same thing of we were talking about before of like, what position can you play? How many positions can you play? How do you put what you know you're best at and put these in different containers or find success and learn quickly? And so I think that's been kind of my approach is as things have changed, how do I continue to adapt, but still hold on to kind of what makes me feel unique or feel like is a strength of mine and just putting it in a different context.
So in a way, the key is to stay in the game and then figure it out there, but just not to leave the game, if that makes any sense.
Stay on the pitch. Yeah. Whatever position you got to play. Obviously, I think it also goes back to what we were saying of like that belief in yourself and wanting to not like, you're not going to see me going too far into like throwing out hot takes or things like that. That's not what I'm good at, I don't think. Even if I tried, I think people would be like, hey, are you okay, man? Like, what's going on there? That's just not who I am, but I know that. So it's like, if I'm in a studio show and it is a little bit more that direction, how do I still be myself in that context? So I think that's the part of like holding on to yourself, even if you're moving into a new realm and having to adapt, but without losing yourself.
When Angelina Anderson was here on the podcast, she's currently the keeper for Angel City FC, my class here for women's soccer. She mentioned something that it's the most amount of text I've ever gotten for something that I didn't clip on social media. And it was that she didn't know what it was, but she always had this sense of belief in herself that she was meant for something. She didn't know what it was, but she just had this inherent feeling. Is that the type of belief that you're talking about? And like, could you describe what it is? Like, do you think it's something that you just feel, or is it something you can build?
I think it's both, but I think I have had the one thing that my mom always taught me was that she felt that she always made me believe in myself, you know, and I think when you have like a role model like that, where she was a single mom and PhD, very successful, but more than anything, I would say passionate about her work as a professor at Berkeley. And so I think I saw that version of, hey, follow your passions, follow your dreams, whatever they are. And I think she gave me that. And so that was really just kind of the only way I knew how to be. And it's not to say that there's not times where I have doubts or I have questions about, hey, am I on the right path? But I've learned to trust my instincts in that respect. And it's taken me pretty far so far. But I think more than anything, it is something that you can strengthen over time as like a muscle, with training where you see, all right, I'm not going to play college soccer. And then it's like, I am going to play college soccer. And then you prove yourself to that. And then you put out the next hurdle and the next one and the next one, they keep coming. But I think it was more that, especially if things don't always come easy to you and you're still able to get past that, I think that's some real strength you can draw upon when you meet that next obstacle. I've seen people struggle more when it's all been smooth sailing and then all of a sudden it's not. And then you have to figure out, how do I pull myself up? I feel like most of life is like, not try to be negative about it, but most of it is not super straightforward. It's not like an easy route, especially if you want to do something special or unique or something that hasn't been done or you feel is scary or hard. So I see you out posting your runs now every day, and I'm like, man, how? Because it looks crazy to me that you could build to that, even as a former top athlete, and still a top athlete, clearly. But I think it's more just like, you get out on the trail and you start running and it gets quicker and it gets easier. And even the hard parts, they start to kind of feel a little bit smoother for you.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I honestly do that is just to kind of like build my sense of belief in all the other areas of my life. And it's interesting that you even mentioned that, because like, I'll just be frank, right? Like, I love this so much. Like, nobody else touches this space. This is my space and I do it because I love it. But there's always that doubt of like, how, like, all right, how am I gonna continue to, right now I'm clearly expanding from the Cal campus, which is great, but it's like taking those next steps, and how do I continue this, and how do I don't know, find a way to make it work. And sometimes I guess, and I'm sure everybody's been through this, but sometimes I just get so caught up in all that self-doubt that I forget that it's the same thing as running. It's the same thing as soccer. It's the same thing in any other area of your life. And it's just the showing up part, like you were saying. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think the part that stands out to me is that nobody's telling you that you have to do this podcast. Like, nobody's coming to you and saying, hey, it's time to podcast, man. Fire up the studio, like, reach out to people. You might get rejected. Like, they might say no, or it might not be possible, or it might not come off the way you expect it, or post that clip. It's time. It's really from something that you're passionate about. And I think I meet people so much that are like, how do I get my kid to play pro soccer and MLS? Or how do I get them to do that? And it's like, it's not up to you. Like, the only thing you can do is, it really is about whether you love something or not. And if you're passionate enough to do it, and if you're going to consistently show up to it. And if you really do love something, it's not really a question even. You just keep going. And I think even for the hard parts, I was like, knee rehab, injuries throughout the professional career, you just do it. You don't even think about it. And I think that's the truth of it all. And I think that's what's cool about what you're doing, man, is just like, you're following an instinct, you're trusting it. It's building clearly. And, but more than anything, it says something about you, that you're not waiting around for an opportunity. And for me, you're a lot further ahead than surely I was at the time. So to be already on this pathway, I feel like is a real positive. But sometimes when you're in it, it's kind of hard to recognize that.
It's always like, I don't know, when you're living life, you're so close to the tree that you forget to take a step back and look at the forest. But I mean, I really appreciate that. Obviously, it means a lot. And yeah, just got to figure it out like everything else. But to go back to you, I have to ask, you already brought it up, but I have to ask about The Movement, your travel series show. Specifically, I mean, one of the best videos that just came up on the YouTube series is Are Americans Any Good at Football? So that was in the UK, right? And obviously the MLS has changed a lot recently, past 5 years, past decade. It seems like it's changing all the time. What were those stories like, traveling to different, not only cities, but countries, and just experiencing different cultures through the MLS lens? Yeah.
So, that show is a good example of kind of trusting your instincts, because that actually started with an independent project I did during the World Cup in 2014. And I started just posting every day with a friend of mine, and we were telling stories of the World Cup, but we were more like, I was interviewing players. I had a friend, a former teammate, that went to the World Cup and played for the U.S. national team, Jeff Cameron. And I took some photos of his tattoos, and he had a sleeve that was like, told basically his family history. And so he was going through showing me like the tattoos of his family, but what that feels like to represent your national team on the world's biggest stage in Brazil. And, these were some of the stories that I felt like weren't necessarily that I had some privy to or been some insight into just from playing with these guys. But I didn't have like an outlet or anything like that. So I just started posting them. And eventually when I started at MLS, we started talking about what's a show that we could develop that we think could be interesting. And for me, it was always the stories behind the players of saying like, hey, I can try to convince you 1,000,000 times to turn on MLS and to watch this match. But I don't know, for some people who are already they were into it. Otherwise, it was kind of difficult at times to get people to buy in. But I figured if there was a different route into explaining, the story of a player that came from a teammate who played in grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. And I always asked him, I was like, how did you end up going from Jackson to the U.S. men's national team? And this is just like a teammate of mine. And the cool part about the show was he was like, well, let's just go to Jackson. And so he showed me his hometown. I ended up finding there were 2 other players from there that were in MLS, and they took me around, and it turned out that there were some Caribbean coaches that had moved to Jackson that had come in and basically grabbed these kids from Jackson that were supposedly just NFL or, American football players or basketball players, and were teaching them soccer. And so, those were some of the kind of like grassroots stories that I felt would be more interesting. So when you're flicking through the channel and you're like, oh, that guy's from Hawaii. Like, I saw this feature about, we went to the North Shore of Oahu. Or we went to Jackson, Mississippi, or the one in the UK where I asked those kids outside of a Man City game, I asked them if Americans were any good at football, and they immediately were like, no way. Which was kind of like, to some degree, the perception. And I think over time it started I went around and found some actual MLS fans that were saying, oh, I actually watch MLS because at the end of the night, there's no more Premier League, and I've kind of gotten interested in Houston Dynamo. And I was like, what? That's crazy. Or somebody was like, I went on holiday to Orlando and I went to Orlando City match and it was awesome. And my club is never going to win a title, but I feel like Orlando City might, and I can't pick Chelsea. Or I can't pick Man City now. So I'm going to just pick up a new league. And so I just think those were some of the kind of impetus or ideas around that series. And then often I think we tend to say that there's not a lot of history in the US, but there is a developing history. So in some ways it felt like this was cataloging what was taking place or how the sport is growing here in the United States and North America overall. And since then I've continued to see it grow with all these new teams popping up all across North America, and the World Cup coming here, and now Messi coming, which has been crazy to be involved with. And, it's been really fun, but I love that series. It was fun. It's now up on Apple TV on MLS Season Pass. And, I think it was, a really awesome experience to be a part of that for those years.
It seems like a recurring theme at this point in our conversation, but it's again, you look back at what you were interested in and the decals that you took or the classes that you took, and soccer, media, storytelling, and then the cultural side to it is just so interesting. And I think the whole fan experience as well, because all eyes are always on the athletes, always on the players, but more and more, I think we're seeing more fans being involved in the media. Is that something you've noticed as well? Because it feels like a sense of community almost. I mean, obviously it is a community. It's like a family, a fan base. But in today's world, that's just like the sports are probably what brings most people together at this point in person, sadly. Have you noticed that change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you think even abroad of like Arsenal fan TV and the momentum around that, I try to check that out. And, or even just like how I follow the NBA is mostly through, and the WNBA is mostly through social media. And I just see the clips of Calen Carr going off or, whatever it might be. And I think that is like, there are so many different ways in. It could be video games. I think for soccer, a lot of people, it's through like EA FC, or I think that's what it's called now. So that's how they learn about the game. And then suddenly they're actually watching the real thing and they're like, oh, this is the guy I play with on EA. And you're like, wow, that's crazy. So I think there's a lot of different ways into it. And I think fans especially have like their own voice. And now you don't have to kind of wait for coverage of your team. You can just start a podcast or you can start a show. I think that's a really cool thing. And players, especially, I think now more and more I'm seeing people take kind of matters into their own hands more, which I think is really cool to do. And, just really smart to do. And I think we're seeing that not just at the pro level, but even, but it's at colleges and, all across different levels of sport.
Where do you see US soccer going? Because you just mentioned it previously, not US soccer as in the federation or the national team, but within your space. Obviously, you already mentioned Messi showing up plays a humongous role. The World Cup coming plays a humongous role. Do you feel like there will be a specific boom? Are we there yet? Like, what do you see through your MLS lens?
I mean, the sport is definitely growing, and I think it has the highest participation rate of any sport across the country. But I think now we see healthier women's pro leagues. NWSL is doing really great, continuing to grow in popularity. The women's national team bringing home the gold was amazing. All the young stars that are emerging through that team as well. There's a lot of talent on the U.S. team. Now Pochettino coming through as the U.S. men's national team coach. We're hosting the World Cup in 2026. From when I played in MLS to where it is now, it's almost unrecognizable with the amount of teams. I travel every weekend and I get to go to these stadiums that are sold out, from St. Louis to Austin to L.A. to Toronto, Nashville, Miami, everywhere. And like it's become the new normal, I think, to see that bigger stars coming over, none bigger than Messi, of course. But I think that also shines like a spotlight into maybe people that aren't paying attention, and then they can hopefully open the aperture a little bit and see there's a lot of talented players coming through, especially from the youth academy level, and then into the first team, and then a lot of guys now being sold abroad to Europe, and not just from the US, guys that come here from Argentina or from Colombia and then move on to Europe afterwards. So I think the sport is in a great place here. I'm a little bit hesitant to be as bullish of like, we have to win the World Cup by X year or whatever, because Americans, we want to be the best at everything immediately, right away. And I'm saying, well, we have a good thing going. Let's progress. Let's continue to push. Let's be ambitious, no doubt about it. And by the way, we do win the Women's World Cup, although not the last one. But I think that is still that's just like, I think we're on the right path, the right trajectory, and to be a piece of it in any way and trying to grow the game feels something that I feel really called to right now, and feel lucky to be a part of.
It's just incredible to see how much is shifting at the moment. Like, who would have thought Pochettino would show up, right? Like that's crazy to think of. And I think it's so awesome to see, for example, right now in Paris, the women's team just win the Olympics, because to some extent, obviously it's not the same game because there's different rules and stuff, but it is like a second World Cup, like the second most important tournament for women. And it's so awesome seeing how like the country will rally, and to see it eventually be matched by the men will be inspiring. But I think these next years, just with Messi, which I've seen, obviously you posted about it when he showed up because it transformed the MLS. But now with the World Cup and the MLS growing, do you think, for example, I mean, I know you work for Apple TV technically, but it's things like that as well, like those media deals. I think, especially in comparison to when you were playing, it's just a totally different sport.
Yeah. No, when I played my second year in MLS, Beckham signed, and that was crazy. The change overnight was night and day, and just the interest, even my own friends that weren't necessarily hitting me up for tickets when there'd be a Beckham game. All of a sudden I was getting messages like, "Hey man, I haven't seen you in a while. What's going on? Would love to come check out a game." And, it was like a traveling circus, and it was amazing. And it raised the stakes for everybody. Like I mentioned, playing in 2 MLS Cups, and the fact that Beckham was there, and that's no disrespect to Landon Donovan, who's for me, probably the best U.S. men's national team player ever, or right up there. And Robbie Keane, all these great players, but, it really elevated the game. But I have to say, compared to Messi, this is like another level. And I got to call one Inter Miami game this year in Montreal, and the crowd that showed up, it was his first time ever playing in Canada. It was in Montreal, 19,000 seat stadium. So not a huge crowd. I'm not even joking. When I got to the stadium, there were people climbing the trees outside the stadium, just trying to get a look at Messi just walking into the ground. And the crowd started chanting Messi, Messi, Messi against their own team at one point, which I feel for the Montreal guys, because that's tough because they're playing and saying this is a home field, but he tilts it on its head because that's just the appeal, the star power, and look, he's the greatest to ever do it. So the fact that he's here in this league and decided to come here is pretty incredible to see. And I think it can, for anybody that's involved in the game and for this next generation, I don't even think we're going to really be able to put on paper like the impact that it has as far as inspiring another generation to come forward and to be able to see the best to ever do it every weekend is pretty incredible.
Do you think there's going to need to be a cycle of these star players coming to the MLS for it to eventually not even break into the top 5 leagues worldwide, but just within the US as well? Because I mean, it's no secret that the NFL is king in the US, right? It's NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL. What do you think has to happen for the MLS to fully break through? Because Beckham, huge deal. I wasn't very conscious at the time, but I watched the documentary and I saw the impact. And now seeing it with Messi, it's humongous. But do we just need to wait until the next star shows up, or what do you think what do you think will it take to just have this massive breakthrough that everybody is expecting?
Well, there's only one Messi, so there's no other comparable where you can just go grab another one. But I think number one, you have to maximize the moments that he's here, and you have to maximize these moments when you do get these sort of transcendental like figures like a Beckham, like a Messi. And the cool part for me was Beckham, when he retired, he had the foresight to stay involved and to have a team, and that became Inter Miami. And then Inter Miami has, all the branding and the pink and the, has the cachet and the coolness, and it's in Miami, and he could pick up the phone and call Messi. And so now he's a part of that next ripple effect. And that's what I'm interested to see. Is it may not be the next Messi, because I think we've tried to do that and failed for so long, just like we've done the next Pele and, all the greats, the next Jordan. That's really hard to happen. But I could see Messi staying involved long term, and how that might shift things in the long term for the sport here and in MLS. But at the other side of it, I don't think it's necessarily about just bringing in the biggest name star power that can bring in eyeballs right away. The cool part that I'm seeing is more at the grassroots level, where the academies are being built out for each teams, and we're developing our own players and creating the next big talent like Alphonso Davies, who's, came through the Vancouver Whitecaps Academy, then went to Bayern Munich and, won the Champions League. And now Real Madrid's around, and we'll see what happens there. But it's just like the fact that you can now create your own players that are pushing on and going from our domestic academies into the first team and then playing at the highest level abroad, I think is a big positive, a big step forward. I don't have all the answers of like what's the next step after that, but I think overall, like, to be a much bigger part of the global market is a big, financially it makes sense. I think it makes sense as far as prestige goes, where now you have scouts all across the world coming to look at 14-year-old Kevin Sullivan in Philadelphia Union is already going to move on to Man City, but is playing first team minutes with the Philadelphia Union. He grew up in Philly. His brother plays pro at 19. He's from a soccer family. So these are the types of like indicators that I'm looking at, that I'm saying, oh, okay, I think we're on the right path here, where it's not just top down. There's like a big bottom up swell that's coming. And I think that's like the most exciting part for me.
Yeah. And it's those stories as well, just to think about, back to the storytelling of, those are two brothers right there. Like, I would love to see a piece on their family or what got them. Because, I mean, yes, the kid is 14. Like,
yes, we do need to remember that. Yes.
Like 14, right? But then his brother, who's a older brother, a pro.
Yeah.
19.
Yeah.
Like, that's still, both are ridiculously young. Like, yes, freshman in high school is crazy, but then freshman in college is also wild. So it's, I don't know. It's those stories like that that's just fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's a special one. And that whole family is like athletes. Both parents played. His grandfather is longtime coach at Villanova University. His cousins are soccer players. Like, it's this whole like Philly soccer heritage story. And, I would love to watch that piece as well. I think there's going to be some stuff coming out about him, but you also have to be careful because 14-year-olds, we've seen that before, where you can begin to bring media attention around and what's best for the player and his development and those things. But, this Kevin Sullivan kid is no joke. I can promise you, I saw him play at 12 years old with 15-year-olds, and there was Bayern Munich, Dortmund scouts on the sideline. Like, it was just a huge crowd to watch this kid play. And he was easily, at 12 years old, better than everybody, head and shoulders, just like rolling people, dribbling through them, back heels, like confidence, personality. So he's got something. And, I try not to hype young players too much, but I think he's the real thing.
It's always crazy to see that level of talent. I'm from San Diego, and I was playing in the development academy back when it was a thing. And the showcase happened to be in Oceanside, and Gio Reyna was playing, but he was 13 or 14 playing with the U18s. And it's just totally different when you see those gaps. But to bring it back to that 14-year-old point, I'm curious on two things for that storytelling bit. The first one is how would you create that sort of piece? You have this story, right? How does it work to take it to pitch it, I guess, to the MLS? Do you just show up and say, look, I think this would work, and it's just a yes or no? Or how do you develop that sort of pitch when you have the idea and then you want to execute it?
Well, they have a full team, a features department at MLS and Apple TV. So there's a lot of people that wake up every day that are thinking about these types of stories whenever new signings come in, or sometimes even ahead of time if they can get tipped off to what's the next move. So part of it is like, last week I got on a plane and went to Salt Lake City, and they just said, hey, can you go interview this manager and coach? They made some new signings. Can you go interview them? And that's really fun. The pitch process for me is like, I just try to build some relationships with people and let them know that I'm always keeping an eye out for stories. I have like a running list always of like, hey, if the next feature series is needed, or if there's a new idea that's needed, how can I contribute, whether I'm taking it and carrying it forward or I'm passing it along to somebody else. So I think that is always kind of like on my mind, as far as, like I'm saying, be available, be ready to play when you get your number called. But, there's a pretty big infrastructure now, and it has become a little more professionalized, I would say, as just the league grows, the infrastructure grows, and Apple TV gets involved. That is like thinking about these things, not just for this year, but next year. And how do they tell the stories that can really kind of elevate the league and take it to the next level?
And the second piece to that, an example like Sullivan, right? What's the balance there, the ethical balance of not only just doing too much and giving too much attention to a 14-year-old, because like you said, we've seen this story before, but also just remembering like he's a minor, so you can't really treat him like all the rest of the pros. Like what is that like, that real hands-on experience? Like, for example, I've seen recently Olympians, right? Because Paris just happened, and there's some teenagers there, and some are still in high school. And it's so interesting to see how the media, or the questions they get asked in compared to the full-on adults that are competing there. Is that like, obviously you have to be careful, but on the ethical side, how does that work?
I think a piece of it comes from having good people around the player specifically. And I know in this case, the fact that he has an older brother or a family that's experienced in the club around him as well, your hometown club. So I would approach each case differently. And I think that goes for any player that you're interviewing, is just figuring out what makes them tick. What are they ready for? What are they not ready for? What do they feel comfortable talking about? Can you talk to people around them? I've interviewed young players, and MLS is getting younger every year. And so I remember Mark McKenzie, who's now playing in France, I believe. He was at Philadelphia Union. I got to meet him one time at a homegrown tournament, and he seemed pretty poised, wise beyond his years. But I texted a buddy, Warren Craval, who I played with in Houston and was teammates with Mark in Philly. He vouched for me and was like, "Hey, Mark, this guy's cool. Can you set up an interview with him?" And I chatted with Mark, and I wasn't on it, but I put together a panel around Black History Month, and Mark was on it, and he totally shined through and was tremendous. And I did another piece with him around the election, where he was doing some stuff to help try to get people out to vote. And I think, in some ways it's just about building relationships, understanding the person, the player, what they care about beyond maybe just what you've seen from them. And sometimes not always going to the obvious place. I think of like, everybody's going to the star player here. And I think sometimes the more interesting stories are not always attached to the biggest name player or the obvious choice. There's often somebody who's just either around it or somebody else that has their own unique, backstory that could be even more interesting and more available to you. So I just try to keep my eyes open to different people. But as far as the ethics go, I think for me, it's just about trying to not try to take something away from somebody, and I'm never going to try to like gotcha journalism, stitch somebody up in a bad spot, because that's the quickest way to never get another interview with somebody else, because word travels quickly. And then I think once you build that trust with some guys in the league, there's always a chance to then get the next guy to participate and go from there.
Just to start wrapping up, because I know you do have another call in a bit, I do have to ask about the transition to broadcasting now. It's something I have very limited experience with, but I put on the headset for 2 Cal games last season, and it's just a different type of feeling. I think it's just so fun, because it's almost like the sport, you're watching the sport you love with someone that just becomes a friend, because you're talking to that person the entire time, and then you get to talk about the game. It seems like the ideal gig. So what was it that led to that transition recently, the past 8 months, I believe, of you putting on the headset and just calling the games?
Yeah, it's been really fun. I think for me, I know you mentioned the impetus behind this podcast was partly because of COVID. And I think part of the reason I've enjoyed going into the match analyst side of broadcasting has been being back at stadiums. And after retiring and then doing more feature work or studio work, both of those are a step removed from, I guess, the real thing or the live experience. And now every weekend traveling to stadiums and feeling the energy of the stadiums. I'm flying to Cincinnati tomorrow. I'm sure it's going to be a sold out match. The Bailey is their supporters group, just behind the goal that, they attack. And, it's just the energy of that and being around the coaches and players. I'll be down on the sideline before the game starts, trying to pick up any little last minute nuggets that I might from who's starting or, what type of tactics they might employ. And I think that just energy of being back at the stadiums feels really good to me. Not to mention a lot of these stadiums are really nice and, in new cities, and you get to experience the culture around the game as well, just on your trip and your time there. But I think the biggest learning I've had so far has been different from features and different from studio is you can plan a lot, but just like playing, you don't know what's going to happen. And ultimately the game decides and the players decide how it's going to go on the pitch. So you kind of have to prepare, but you have to prepare for anything and prepare for everything. So the depth of analysis and the amount of research that goes into each weekend has had to level up times like 10 for me, where you're going deep into depth charts and watching all these past matches and trying to, talk to managers, which luckily we get to speak to. I just spoke to Cincinnati's head coach, Pat Noonan, before our podcast. And, you ask him about the tactics, any question you have about what position he's going to play. And, there comes with some trust of not violating that trust as well. Same as we talked about with player interviews. But, the insight that you end up getting from doing that and the proximity to playing, I don't know if you felt it, but it feels close to being a part of the actual match experience, although without the running and without the injuries. And I try to still play for fun. Every week here in New York with a bunch of friends, I go up to a rooftop every Thursday, and a bunch of ex-pros and really top players, and small-sided pitch. We get the music going, get the views of Manhattan skyline. It's amazing. But I almost do that partly just to remind myself, like, this game's not so easy. And because it's easy to sit up there on your perch during a match and be like, why didn't you play the ball there? He was wide open. Like, what is this coach thinking? And then you just actually kind of ground yourself back in the experience of playing again and remember, oh no, this is different. This is how it feels. This is what it feels like when you're exhausted in, 90-degree heat, and it's the 78th minute of a match and you have to continue pushing. So I think, I try to stay connected to it. But being back at stadiums again, for me has been really reconnecting with the sport in a new way, and something I've really been enjoying.
It's just so nice what you're describing of feeling some sort of game pressure, because like you said, obviously we'll use this as an example. This isn't live. So if we for some reason mess up, I could just edit it and we're fine. But when you're live TV and you're reacting, like, it's one thing to post reaction videos on YouTube, but again, you can edit those. When you're reacting in person on live TV, there's just a different rush. And yeah, it's incredible. I do have one last question to close out officially, and just on overall, I do consider you a very multifaceted person, just with soccer, with your storytelling, with the fashion that unfortunately we didn't get to talk too much about, but you have your own fashion brand. With all these things and all your passions and interests, what advice, obviously you've mentioned the follow your passions bit, but what advice would you give to multifaceted student athletes that are just trying to figure something out? Is it as simple as just follow your curiosity? Is it just that, or what more specific advice could you give?
I think following your instincts and your passion is most important, but I think picking the piece of it that you find most interesting. And I think going back to our conversation, I think the storytelling part for me was the part that kind of like sunk its teeth in to me. So with the movement show, it was finding maybe some of the untold stories in North American soccer as we're growing, and how do you weave in the 1970s Howard University, HBCU only national championship in Division I's men's soccer at that time, to win it all. And then how does that tie to current DC and DC United and, black soccer history there? And, that was really the through line for me, but the storytelling piece, how do you put that into other things? So when I'm not doing the features, every match, every 90 minutes is a story. So I just had to shift my mind to saying, okay, well, this is just live storytelling. So this is just a little bit of a different shift than maybe the feature work. Or the studio is also, how do you tell the narrative of this season in MLS? And what does Messi mean? And what does this signing mean when you zoom out a little bit? And that's another story. So I think the storytelling part is the part that I've tried to hold on to regardless of what type of, media or platform, podcast, video, series, whatever it is, and then continuing to hone that piece of it. Cause I think that's where you can kind of separate yourself or make yourself unique. And then it doesn't actually even feel like you're doing different things. Like, they are different and they might seem disparate or disconnected, but they start to feel the same because you're kind of drawing upon the same thing.
That's so interesting that you just feel how connected it all is. Like, you feel it's the exact same thing, just in different mediums.
Yeah, but I mean, there's still some that I prefer other than others, and I think some of it is like I like the challenge of like having to do that, because it's the same thing as if I preferred to play striker, but I found in a few matches, I found myself at right back, or I found myself chasing the ball against Real Salt Lake in the middle of midfield in Houston one day, where I was like, man, I have to play center midfield right now, and I have to think 360 degrees. And that's different than when I'm playing on the wing or up top and I have my back to goal, or I'm trying to stretch the field in behind. And like, to be able to still bring your strengths into different positions, I think has been something that I've had to do, but has also been a strength of mine and something I've developed, both on the field and then I think off the field as well. But, yeah, I think that's kind of the way I look at it. But I think like a lot of us who have gone to, high level of playing Division I college soccer or just doing anything you love and having to fight for it. I think when it doesn't quite work out or when you have to shift a little bit and make it different, you can then either say, well, I don't really want to do that anymore. Cause some people I know have done that and that's totally fine. They go and do something completely different. But for me, I always felt I wanted to hold on to the soccer piece of it and some of that feeling that I described and, that I know you feel too. And then it's like, how do you adapt that and take that piece that you love and then put it into a new arena? And the cool part, I think, once you do that is there's not really like for playing, there's like an end date and there's a certain point where your physical attributes start to diminish and your mental attributes start to go higher. And there's a nice little sweet spot that you want to prolong as long as possible. And I think I got to enjoy some of that. But then at a certain point, it starts to turn the other direction. And whereas I think in some of these other skills, you can continue more of like a steady climb. And I think that's like a nice feeling to know that you can continue to get better at something without having that same risk where you know that there's a shot clock running in your head.
Incredible. I get my biggest takeaway from all of that is to play the game, stay on the pitch, regardless of the position and just find a way to make it work. But yeah, that whole shot clock metaphor is also great because there is a deadline to the physical aspect of sports, but it doesn't have to be the same for storytelling. Calen, that's all I have for you today. I really, really appreciate you making the time for this. I know you have a busy schedule, did this in between calls. You have a flight tomorrow, all these things going on. So I really do appreciate it. And hopefully we can do it in person sometime, whether I'm in New York or you're back in Berkeley. I'd love to make it happen.
I would love that, man. I want to just say, like, I remember you coming up to me and chatting after the training at Golden Bear, I think in probably your freshman year. And I thought that really stood out to me where I was like, oh, this guy is taking the initiative. So then to now be on the other side of an interview feels, like inevitable and really cool. And I think it's something I felt proud of being like a Cal athlete. And I think Berkeley brings out, some really interesting people and people that are really going for it. And I keep track of all your stuff and have been tracking your progress. So I'm really proud of or you should feel really proud of what you're building. And, and go Bears. I couldn't forget saying that.
Always, always, always go Bears. I really appreciate it. And I hope this is the first of many conversations.